Hey everybody, it's Matthew, and this is going to be our video on conventional financing and appraisal contingency. And as it says, it's for conventional financing. We've gone over and done videos on cash offer and the appraisal process. We'll do FHA, we'll do VA, and then I think there's another one or two we need to throw in there. But this will be the conventional financing. So conventional financing is pretty straightforward. We've got our general information here at the top that goes in every addendum. And then paragraph 1 says the buyer will pay upfront and monthly mortgage insurance premiums as required by the lender. In other words, to say there's going to be a mortgage on the property. The deed of trust is going to be put against your property until it's paid off and released in 30 years or 15 years. And that you understand you're going to make some payments. The contract is contingent on the financing being attained by the buyer. And so we wanted to put a couple paragraphs in here, some things to protect the buyer, and also gives the seller some attempts or efforts to enforce the contract in time of the essence. So just a word before we get into this, do remember that in your core contract it says that the buyer is going to make application within 7 days and they're going to pursue financing diligently. It's important to remember here that your buyer has selected a particular type of loan or lender. And they've named it in the first page of the contract under financing, where they stated how much of a loan they're going to get and what the rough details are going to be of that. If for some reason your buyer can't get a loan, there's going to be some defenses here for them to get out, but only if they've shown goodwill and good faith and acted accordingly in pursuing the loan. If they just don't turn in stuff, they can't get it done on time, they're not participating or helping out the loan officer, they could still be in default. Those are separate issues. That is just simply not performing. So when we get to this this contingency, it is not as broad in its interpretation as many people pretend it to be. It does require the parties to act in a very specific way. So we're going to start off here remembering that anywhere that there's somewhere you and I can type in a field, that it is because contracts are dynamic, that the situation of your buyer and seller are going to be different from one transaction to another. And so the dates past ratification or for appraisal that are you listed here may be very different for another consumer who's moving further along. And I do want you to do the math on this. If you go too short, if you give too few days for the finance contingency, it may mean that the appraiser could never get out there in time and get it done in the right amount of time. It could be too shallow of a date or too few days, and so that the seller is given more power than they really should in this. And then if you go too long, then it gives the buyer too much time. So it's good to kind of think about what your transaction is, the type of loan you're getting, what the lender and loan officer say, and other factors that may contribute to the contingency period. So by the previous contract had language that says we recommend 21 days, and down the appraisal that language has been carried over to the revised contract that came out in 2016. But it is only a recommendation. It does only give you some guideline. It is not contractual. It's not an obligation. It is assumed by most people that 21 days or 3 weeks after ratification is generally enough time to get this done. But watch your deadlines. Remember that most of your appraisers are given about 10 days after they're given at the property and have done what they need to do to get the appraisal to get it back. So you're already looking at about half of the time you're writing down if you put 20 days or 21 days in there just for the appraisal. Most of the time, we are all aware that the lender typically does not issue a commitment letter or fulfill their obligation to get a loan, oftentimes until the day of or the day before closing. Well, that's the contract here is a little aspirational. It's what we should be looking for and doing, not what the lender's doing. So if you're the buyer's agent working with the buyer and helping with their lender, you carry some obligation to usher that lender along and ask them to not drag their feet and not wait till the last minute. So we say here that the contract is contingent until 9 p.m., however many days you wish to put in there, after the date of ratification, which is going to be referred to as a finance deadline, which gives the buyer the opportunity to obtain and deliver to the seller the commitment from the lender. And that's what all this is hinged on. It's going to call back in subparagraph A here that this is going to be outlined in the price and specified financing paragraph on the first page of your ratified contract, your core contract. It's going to say here in paragraph B that this is going to be this deadline is all going to be satisfied so long as everybody acts accordingly and delivers the documents. However, if a commitment by the lender is not delivered by day 21 or whatever, this contingency continues on. And so just to chat here for a minute, and I've done other videos on this, but it is generally improper and probably not in your client's best interest for you, the listing agent, to send over a demand for the lender commitment on day 21. And you go, okay, I've got this, I better do it. That demand by the seller to the buyer should only be done if the seller does have another buyer in the wings, doesn't want to sell anymore, or for any other reason truly understands that this is handing the buyer an opportunity to get out of the contract and not be in default. So it says here that this contingency, when it expires, so let's say we put 20 days in here. Let's say that it expires. We've gone down to day 21 and no one's delivered anything and no one's asked for anything. Then we keep plodding along and we keep moving towards closing as we always should. However, after day 20, the seller is given the opportunity to say, dear buyer, I want to see a commitment from your lender. Now, when the seller sends over that requirement, that notice, okay, and they're going to send it over to whatever the delivery notice paragraph is in the contract, the buyer then has 3 days to either deliver notice or void the contract. So think about this. You're the seller and you're the listing agent. You send over to the buyer agent a notice that says, by the way, it's day 21. We want to see that loan commitment. Then the buyer has either the option to go to their lender and go, let's give them the commitment, which then relieves this contingency because now the lender has committed and the buyer, unless they screw something up, needs to go to closing and they lose the protection of this. Well, they don't lose the protection. They have matured the protection of this contingency and now this is the loan they have and the commitment's been met. If they cannot get it from the lender or they don't want to quite yet give up that right, that contingency, they can then say, we're just not going to respond. If the buyer doesn't respond and doesn't deliver by 9 p.m. on the third day, the contract's void. The buyer's not in default and they get to walk away. Now, I see a lot of very eager and very on the ball listing agents trying to enforce this day 20 or 21 to get it off the books, to say, okay, this part of the contract's done, we got it locked in. But you're probably not truly serving your seller's interest by being that alpha. So what you should be doing is working with the seller, and then the point they say, you know what, we really think we can get a better deal. We sold for less than we went under contract rather for less than we thought we could get for the house. We got another buyer or two who's walked in, made backup offers, and we're willing to risk it. We're willing to say if the buyer wants to walk, they can walk. Then the seller should send over that letter. But in rare occasions is that true, generally the seller wants to work with the buyer. They don't want the buyer to walk off. So don't try to expedite that date or that process unless your seller's on board and willing to pay that consequence. All right. So if the buyer does not void the contract in 3 days and does deliver the to the seller, then the contract contingency is removed and the contract will remain in full force in effect without a contingency. If the contract is void, or the contract rather is going to be void if prior to that date or prior to closing, anytime prior to when the seller has said, give me that letter, if the buyer gets a written rejection from the lender, written rejection is a very important part here. It's got to be written rejection and it has to be delivered, and it has to have been on the type of loan that was specified in the price and specified financing paragraph on the contract. So think about this for a second, this way. If the buyer, for whatever reasons that aren't in their control, and again, remember that a buyer who quits his job or goes out and buys a new car or furniture or something that now no longer qualifies from the loan, that is not acting in good faith. That is not simply, oh, can't get a loan, we're out of here. That's not how that works. That the buyer needs to have acted in good faith and done nothing stupid to prevent him from getting the loan. If he voluntarily quits his job, he didn't act in good faith. He can't simply get a letter saying he no longer applies and to walk away. He may be liable to the contract or responsible for his actions under the contract. So in paragraph C, what we're saying here is that the buyer, through no fault of their own, does get a written rejection from the lender for the loan they're trying to get. So if I name conventional financing in the first page of the contract, and then 2 days later I apply and my lender talks to me in FHA, but I never do any other contingency and I just switch loans, then I lose the protection of the finance contingency because I don't have the proper contingency in place for the type of loan I've elected to pursue. Now, you can go out and get an FHA loan when you stated conventional, so long as it doesn't cost the seller any more money and doesn't delay closing. If it costs the seller more money or delays closing, and you did not get a new contingency appropriate for the type of lending that you were applying for, you've lost the protection of the contingency, finance contingency, and you are most likely in default. All right, paragraph D. Paragraph D says, even if this is not removed, if you don't close at settlement for any reason other than lender denial of financing, you're probably in default, unless it's default of the seller or mutual release. Okay, if the contingency is expired and not been removed or satisfied, and there's a delay in settlement because of the CFPB rules and the new disclosure rules that came out a couple years ago, the buyer's not in default. So that language is pretty important to add, because remember there's a 3-day period prior to closing in which the buyer has to review the closing disclosure statement to make sure all the numbers make sense and the lender hasn't lied to them and they're okay with all of that. If for some reason that does not get delivered and it's not the buyer's fault, then even if this is, unless this has been removed, even if it's not expired yet, they are not in default of the contract. And again, in paragraph F, buyer and seller can agree to different terms. It just takes a written addendum. Under paragraph 3 is the appraisal contingency. So we're going to say the contract is almost always contingent on an appraisal, and then they have X number of days, and again, it could be 21 days. But think about this. If you do 21 days for the appraisal and 20 or 21 days for the finance contingency, that appraisal may not have been delivered by then. So this continues on, the finance contingency continues on up until closing. So we want to say that the appraisal contingency, which is a part of the finance contingency, is going to be satisfied if and when the appraisal is delivered. And so we have the 21 days here that it's contingent upon. And if they don't get it to you within 21 days, the seller has a choice, same choice they had before. Do we push this issue? Do we just keep going with it? Do they lose the contingency? Or do they lose the protection? Generally speaking, everybody ignores this until the appraisal comes in. This is really just there to try to give some structure to the contract so that the seller has some leverage in case the buyer isn't behaving quickly or appropriately. All right, subparagraph A. The appraisal is not equal to, so this is a notice, and that's the important part too. Sorry, I missed that. The buyer shall provide notice to the seller. Now notice that notice is a capital N, which means it needs to be on the notice form. This isn't a lowercase n that would simply say, hey, let me know, send me an email, shoot me a text, we're good. This actually says the buyer will provide notice to the seller by the appraisal deadline and under one of these following conditions. So it is a written notice, and the buyer does have an obligation to send that notice. There is one that is specific to appraisals over to the listing side whenever they know what's going on. So A, the appraisal is equal to or greater than the sales price, the contingency is satisfied and removed, and the parties shall proceed to settlement. Now there's some confusion here. Some people have read this to say the finance contingency is removed because the appraisal came in. That's not what it's saying. Notice it's all in this subparagraph, paragraph 3. It is not in subparagraph 2, or paragraph in paragraph 2 and 3. Anyways, so if this is the appraisal contingency, which is removed once the appraisal is in, or the appraisal is not equal to. So you have to make one of the elections on the appraisal notice form. Letter B, subparagraph B here is going to be the appraisal is equal to or greater than sales price. However, the buyer elects not to proceed with the contract because the property does not satisfy the lender's requirements. So the property could have value but not be an appropriate property for this type of loan. Maybe you wanted to put horses on it and they don't do equestrian loans, or it's in the wrong, it won't be wrong side of town, that'd be redlining, but it's in the wrong, it's in a non-conforming area. It could be any number of reasons in which the lender may say, yes, it still has value, it still is worth what the appraisal is, but the other things that came up in the appraisal do not meet the conditions of the loan, therefore we can't give it to you. The buyer would not be in default, but they would need to give notice in a proper time frame. And then C, the appraisal is not equal to or greater than the sales price, and the buyer elects not to proceed with the consummation unless the seller elects to lower the sales price to the appraised value. So in other words, our C option is, it didn't appraise, the numbers didn't come in, we are not going to move forward unless you agree to lower your numbers here. So again, this has to be in writing, and it needs to have a copy of the written appraisal. It will be the seller's option to lower the price. So in other words, it's saying the seller doesn't have to lower the price. They can release the buyer. They can't compel the buyer to move forward unless they lower the price, but they could elect to stay on their price and let the buyer go and put it back on the market. If seller doesn't make the selection, the parties may agree to any other type of terms, whatever those terms would be. And each election has 3 days. So if I send you over the notice saying, hey, it didn't appraise, sorry, but we're not going to buy it for more than the appraised value. Here's the number. What do you want to do? The seller has 3 days to respond. Seller comes back in day 2.5 and says, we won't lower the price, but we'll do something else. I just drew a blank. I don't know what else you would do if you don't lower the price. There could be a number of other variables that they could reach out to, but they would have to make some election. When the seller comes back, the buyer has 3 days to respond, and back and forth. And then eventually, if any party fails to reach an agreement and the 3 days elapse from either return, then the contract's void, just done. And there's no default by the parties. And then D would be the option saying, we don't care what the appraisal say, we're going to go ahead and buy it anyways. Assuming they have a conventional loan in which they're allowed to bring money in excess of the appraisal, in excess of the loan, which generally only happens or is allowed to happen in VA most of the time, they could move forward. If the buyer fails to give seller notice by the deadline, the contingency will continue unless the seller at your option sends over the notice. So this is just like the first part of this. In the finance contingency, it says, you got a contingency, it's going to continue on to closing. But on this date, if we haven't performed yet, the seller can call it due and say, we're ready now. Just understand that although we're doing this in two different sections, that most of the time, if you call forth and demand the appraisal and they can't perform, they're going to have 3 days to get out of the contract too, and they almost have to. Otherwise, they try to go forward with a contract in which they don't know what the value is without the protection of the appraisal. And that's all well and good. But if the appraisal contingency lapses and the seller calls forth and says, hey, give us a copy of the appraisal or we're getting rid of this addendum, the buyer doesn't void and the buyer can't perform, the lender later gets the appraisal and the appraisal is low, the lender's still not going to give you a loan. So you go back to the earlier paragraph that has the general what to do if I can't meet the criteria of the loan. So I'm not sure there's any value really for the seller to call due the appraisal contingency without calling due the finance contingency. Paragraph 4 is how much money is the seller going to give to the buyer to assist them with charges and fees? And a question I pretty routinely get is, what can that money go to? And really, it's anything. It's including but not limited to, and it gives some samples there. It's not limited to that. It's anything the lender will allow is what the buyer can use that money for. Now, here's an important part too. It says it is the buyer's responsibility to confirm with the seller about their entire credit being used. And so this is a pretty important paragraph. So if the lender says you can only have 3% of the loan price towards seller concession, and the seller has given the buyer 3% for closing cost assistance, and then a home inspection is done, and during the home inspection they find a bunch of stuff, and the seller goes, I'll just give you some more money, I'll give you a credit. Before the buyer says yes to that, they need to call, better yet, email their loan officer and say, is this permitted? We've got 1.5% in repair credits coming in, 3% in our closing cost credits. That's a total of 4.5%. You said your cap was 3. 9 times out of 10, that lender's going to say, no, you got to get it repaired before closing or addressed before closing, put something in escrow, maybe, if they allow that, but you cannot get more than whatever our cap is. If the buyer does not check with the lender and they sign off in the home inspection and go, seller's going to give us 10 grand in repair in lieu of repairs, and the lender comes back and says you can't have that 10 grand, the buyer's just out of luck. It was the buyer's duty to check with their lender to ensure that they could use that money and ratify it in an agreement. If the sellers agreed to do it and was still willing to do it and the buyer just can't use it, they have to move forward without the credit. That was up to the buyer to check with their lender about before they made that election. Paragraph 5 in the last paragraph is the lender required repairs, and this one's pretty straightforward as well. If a lender comes back after the appraisal is done and says there's a bunch of things that need to be repaired, the seller can either elect to say, I'm not going to do that, in which the buyer can leave the contract, and the seller needs to know that they're permitting the buyer to leave the contract if the seller refuses to repair. Or they can come together with some type of repair agreement about how this is to be done and come up with the agreement in writing prior to the contingency ending. They have to do that within 5 days after the seller's been given notice that there are repairs to be done. So you can't sandbag this. You can't just play it out and see what happens at closing. You got to address it. If the repairs are required, the seller either does it or they don't. If they don't, the buyer can move on. So that's it. It's pretty straightforward. None of the things that are found in there, none of that lender required stuff supersedes any prior agreements to do home inspections or keep anything in good repair. Remember, your contract is as is, except for the date of the home inspection, unless you check the other boxes. A day of home inspection. So anything new that breaks after that date, it still has to be repaired. It doesn't way out of that. So that's it. If you have any questions, let your brokers know. They'll be happy to sit down and chat with you. Thanks.